Berlin and Lib Dems Overseas for putting on today's webinar. And thanks to the CEO of the Paddy Ashdown Forum, Chris Gleadle, for handling the technical side in conjunction with our big brother, the European Liberal Forum, of which PAF is the UK member. The first ever item on our website was the text of Chris Patton's speech on Hong Kong at a meeting presided over by Alistair. This was appropriate given Paddy's commitment to Hong Kong and China too, having learned Mandarin. He was at the handover of the territory to China. On the way back, it was on the tarmac at Astana Airport that he had negotiated with Tony Blair a form of proportional representation for the European Parliament. Also, Paddy called for residential rights in the UK for British overseas nationals, unpopular at the time, but prescient in the current circumstances, with even our xenophobic government adopting this policy. We all deeply regret the passing of this great friend of Hong Kong and its people. He would have been so pleased to be associated with today's event. Thank you, Marlene.
Well, thank you, Robert. And for those who are not aware, Robert was really instrumental to the setting up of the Paddy Ashdown Forum, which we're so proud of, a centrist think tank that's a member of the European Liberal Forum. So may I just join Robert in welcoming everyone here, my distinguished panelists, as well as all the participants. And before introducing our speakers, may I just say, it is, of course, my huge privilege to moderate this webinar today on this important date. In fact, today, 1 year since the Chinese government imposed sweeping national securities legislation on Hong Kong. We have witnessed seismic changes to the political landscape in Hong Kong. And I must say, our focus today is from the point of view of the UK and the international community. Though we also want to hear from our friends and supporters in Hong Kong, we need to hear your voices and your concerns to ensure any recommendations take into account the real situation and developments there. Needless to say, UK, as party to the Sino-British Joint Declaration signed in 1984, has legal and moral obligations towards the people of Hong Kong. The introduction of NSL, if I may just abbreviate it, on 30th of June last year has been a game changer. And each week brings news of arrests, new appointments to strengthen law and order there, as well as restrictions on media and other freedom of expression. But what do the majority of the people in Hong Kong want? And what does it mean for us when we say we stand with Hong Kong? According to a Reuters report, which was carried out by the Hong Kong Public Opinion Research Institute in August 2020, after the NSL, showed that while 60% oppose the national security law, only 44% support the pro-democracy protest movement, and 19% support independence from China. Perhaps our speakers could let me know if there have been any updates on that. So due to the breadth and ambiguity, as well as extraterritoriality of the NSL, we don't want to risk the safety of any of our attendees today, whether in UK, Hong Kong, or abroad. For that reason, may I just mention a couple of housekeeping rules. This webinar will be recorded so that it can be viewed on our PAF YouTube channel at a later time, but all attendees may choose, if they wish, to remain anonymous now. Questions will therefore be filtered through myself as the moderator, but you should, if you like to be named, let me know, and I will attribute the question to you. Of course, if you prefer, just put anon. The chat line will therefore not be open to everyone, but can be viewed by the panelists. So I'm very pleased and honored now to introduce, to shed light on the debate, our first keynote speaker, the Right Honourable Alistair Carmichael MP. He has been MP for Orkney and Shetland since 2001 and has been a champion of human rights over the last 18 years. During the coalition government between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, he was Secretary of State for Scotland, and since then has served as Home Affairs and Foreign Affairs spokesperson for the party. He will be sharing with us his invaluable work campaigning for the rights of Hong Kongers as co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Hong Kong, established in 2019. It's largely through his amazing work bringing forward the private members' bill on Hong Kong with pressure from other like-minded politicians that has led to the UK government coming up with their £43 million welcome package this year, as well as promise to grant Hong Kong BNO passport holders the right with pathway to citizenship in the UK after 5 years residence. Also on our panel are Simon Cheng and Julian Chan, who co-founded the Hong Kongers in Britain not-for-profit organization based in the UK. Both of them were former officers of the British consulate in Hong Kong, and HKB aims to empower and help Hong Kongers who have recently moved to the UK. Last but not least, we have to give a response, our Liberal Democrat peer and honorary president of the Lib Dem Overseas, Baroness Selbrinton. And then we will have our question and answer session. So may I now invite Mr. Alistair Carmichael to address us first. Over to you, Alistair.
Merlin, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to Lib Dems Overseas and to the Paddy Ashdown Foundation for organising this today. As Merlin has said, I serve in Parliament as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hong Kong, also in a sort of related initiative I founded and I'm co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Uyghurs. I mention that because, and I think this is entirely appropriate for a Lib Dem gathering and Paddy Ashdown's name attached to it in particular, my concern in engagement with China and in particular in relation to Hong Kong and other human rights concerns I have with the current Chinese government is something which, as a Liberal, comes from two of the things that are most important to me. First of all, internationalism, but secondly, also our concern for human rights. These are two principles, two concerns that I think run to the very heart of liberal democracy, and that is why I have become involved in these over the years. I think it was also the reason why the late Paddy Ashdown was so active in the field, and you know, Paddy was at his heart a Liberal who cared about internationalism and who cared also about human rights, and who understood, as I think we all must, that the defining characteristics of human rights is their universality. And if we don't care about human rights abuses that we find just because they are somewhere far away, or for whatever other excuse we find for ignoring human rights abuses, and given the contribution from some in the party recently, I think this is pertinent, then frankly, we don't care about human rights at all. It is also, I think, undeniably the case, though, that there are those in this space politically who don't approach the subject from the same first principles that we do. And occasionally we find ourselves working with those with whom we might not in other circumstances be that comfortable. The sort of peak point for me in that regard was when I found myself in a briefing with the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in this latter part of last year. A more unlikely situation I find it difficult to think of, and as Merlin says, I was a coalition government minister for 5 years, so I think I can claim some pedigree in working with people who are not intuitively on the same page as us. And, you know, for those people who do raise the same concerns that we do, if they do it from the point of view of wanting to isolate China, then frankly they do it from different principles than ours, and we have to make that very, very clear. And you know, in seeking to engage with China, I'm always at pains to emphasize that simply because of the size of China, her recent diplomatic history and the size of her economy, you have to do it on the basis of international multilateral institutions. However difficult that may be, however ineffective these institutions may occasionally look. We also find different ways of doing it, which I would commend to you in particular, Jeffrey Nice QC and his work in relation to the China Tribunal. The other point I want to make just historically, because I think it is important and it does tie into Paddy's history in relation to Hong Kong and China, is just to remind you, first of all, why it was that we ended up with the Joint Declaration in 1984, and how in fact that demonstrated that we have never really learned the lessons that made it necessary, and how things might have been different if Paddy's approach in the late 1990s had actually been taken. I want to take you back in that regard, not even to 1984, but to 1982 and the Argentinian invasion of the Falkland Islands. Now, that was essentially something that happened because the Galtieri junta was emboldened by the thought that Britain didn't really care about holding the Falkland Islands anymore. And as a consequence, there was an invasion, there was a war, and it was accepted after that that the wrong signals had been sent to Argentina. Knowing that then the expiry of the lease period in respect of Hong Kong was coming up in 1997, it was thought, and sensibly thought, that an arrangement such as the Joint Declaration would be good diplomacy. It was sensible politics, and so it was. You had the period then from the Joint Declaration being entered into in 1984 to the handover in 1997. But that was the point at which Paddy was telling us and telling the world that the path to residency or citizenship is now offered by the UK government should have been made available, that the creation of the BNO passport holder status was the wrong signals to be sending. For whatever reason, our own government then and since until very recently resisted that. And I would argue that the refusal to take that action, to send that very early signal about our future intentions with regard to the people of Hong Kong and our determination to use the expression that Merlin has used, to stand with the people of Hong Kong, was definitely weakened. And you know, the situation where you ended up with pro-democracy movement protests, and then you had the national security law, wasn't something that happened overnight. It happened as part of a long, slow burn. And throughout that long, slow burn, the United Kingdom government continued to send the wrong signals. It continued to send signals to China in relation to trade and cooperation, and in relation to China's foreign policy, in relation to Africa and elsewhere in the globe, that we would be complicit in the abuses for which they were responsible in relation to human rights. We softened the message, we wound our neck in, and then it ultimately precipitated the crisis where the UK government has been forced now, because of our historic obligations to people in the territory to act in the way that we have done. So it pains me to say this as somebody who still regards Britain generally as being a force for good on the international stage, but we have failed the people of Hong Kong. Indeed, on a wider sense, outside the mechanisms and the machinations of the Chinese Communist Party, I think we continue to fail the people of China as a whole by refusing to engage as vigorously and wholeheartedly in an exposition of the human rights problems that exist within China to this day. As some of you will be aware, in the last Parliament, I introduced a private member's bill to introduce what would effectively be what we now know as the pathway to citizenship for BNO passport holders. I did that because I felt it was important that there was somebody in Parliament who was saying that here is a mechanism whereby we can make good the mistakes of the past. In fact, what the government has subsequently done has more or less, not completely, but more or less met the objectives of my private members' bill. So it having fallen with all other private members' bills at the end of the last parliamentary session before the Queen's speech, which was in May, I think it unlikely that we will be bringing it back, unless it is necessary as we see the pathway to citizenship opening up and developing, to find another mechanism that might encourage the government to catch those who might not be caught by the pathway, or be able to find another route to the support and safety that they require. I think now my attention is focused differently. It is about how we do our best to support those people who are in Hong Kong, because I'm pretty certain, we'll hear this maybe from Simon and Julian, that they would much rather be in a democratic Hong Kong than have to come and live here in the United Kingdom. But, you know, when you see what is happening in Hong Kong at the moment, and you see what's happening, for example, with Apple Daily, then we know that this is a situation that is bad, and it's only going to be getting worse. So my focus now, I think, is encouraging the government to do more to make meaningful representations and to introduce meaningful measures in relation to those responsible for the human rights abuses in Hong Kong and elsewhere in China, and also domestically to create an environment whereby those who are already here from whichever part of China, but are safe and free from racism and abuse, and that those who are coming here will be given every possible assistance to establish their homes here, to be welcomed here. Because the commitment to the people of Hong Kong, I think, has got to go beyond a government scheme such as the pathway to citizenship. And let's just say, without broadening the terms of our discussion too far, that there are a lot of strands of government policy in respect of immigration and nationality at the moment that do not make people coming here feel welcome and valued in the way that I would want our Hong Kong friends and family to feel welcome and valued. So, Merlin, I think my allotted time is just about up. So I'm going to conclude my remarks at that for the moment. Just to remind you that, you know, this is a campaign which is rooted in liberal values about democracy, about the respect for the rule of law and for human rights, and that we want to see this continue in that vein. If occasionally that means we have to work with others who come to the same space for different reasons, then we hold our nose and we do exactly that. So thank you. You would maybe need to unmute, Merlin.
Any lip readers out there? Do I have to repeat myself? Thank you, Alistair. It was really interesting to hear your work in Parliament and with the Hong Kong Bill and your commitment to human rights. But I have also heard you speak time and again that we shouldn't isolate China and continue to engage China and get them to engage with the international multilateral institutions. So next up, our second speaker will be Simon Cheng, co-founder of Hongkongers for Britain. And as I mentioned, he was with the British consulate. He was a former investment officer. And today, Simon will share with us the impact of the NSL on Hong Kong and whether he believes the pro-democracy movement is now halted in its tracks, or maybe the opposition politicians need to carve out new roles for themselves.
Thank you.
Over to you, Simon.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Hong Kongers in Britain, as one of the civic groups, I, with my partners, Julian, are very honored to be here to share our viewpoint. So I did the presentation, so hopefully that all of you can see it. So today I wanted to share my personal insights about the Hong Kong democracy movement, where it and how did it reshape the political landscape. So as we may know, that we generally within our Hong Kongers community, we always talk about three fronts for Hong Kong democracy. The first one, of course, on the street for demonstration. The second one, for engaging within the system to run for elections within the council, within the parliament. And the third one, of course, international front, which is international lobbying, asking for international support and attention. And let's briefly to introduce the political landscape here. And first of all, we can say mainly that we have two different camps. One is for establishment and one is for anti-establishment. And usually the people, if they stand as like neutral and then what they core value they care is prosperity for the Hong Kong city. And usually why I would just put it into not exactly the middle is because usually though people have that mindset, they are based on realism, and quite many people that they would lean on establishment rather that they would care or they really wanted to fight for a democracy or freedom. And it really based on, of course, that they want it, but if that's the reality is not allowed it, then they would prefer to stand with the establishment. And moreover, if you can see, and that's some of the people, they would care about the core value as order, that social order, because they would believe that as a foundation to support and sustain the prosperity. That means that's materialism. They care about money, they care about economic performance. And moreover, if you can see that show it red is how to govern the Hong Kong. As you may know, that the Beijing wanted to impose not only national security law, but also the principle and the mindset that only patriots could govern Hong Kong. So how could they filter those people that have been selected for the leaders of Hong Kong? It means how patriotic they will be. So that they would also need to be nationalistic. But we also talk about the yellow camp, the anti-establishment. So those people that they always protest, they care about idealism, which is democracy, freedom. That is what they believe is a core value of Hong Kong. And also that they care about liberalism, that they believe that the government should listen to the voice of the people, and that's they really wanted to fight for it. But the tactics, in terms of tactics, they wanted to do it peacefully. But if that's the situation is gonna be frustrated and really works and they see the suppression, and we start to see one way they counter the patriotism or nationalism to China, that's we call it localism. It means that they want to cultivate a self-identity as a Hong Kongers. And you can see even the tactics of the protests are gonna be aggressive. So what kind of the values that they care about? when we see that's those people that leaned on establishment, they care about the output legitimacy, which means that they really care about how to govern and what's the result. And what they care is that, wow, China is going to be powerful, rich, and you can see that is a lot of achievement in terms of technology, in terms of economy, whatever. That's the belief. That's the definition of the Chinese civilization. That's what the government claim. And if you see those people in anti-establishment, they really care about input legitimacy, why it governs. So that's they care about why we should listen to the government, because that's the government listen to the people. The input legitimacy means that they care about why that they can govern, because that's the belief that the government should be composed by the people and listen to the view of the people. And through that, you can see some of the people, no matter which side they are, they also claim themselves as supporting rule of law. Because that is throughput legitimacy, that means the due process or the procedures justice, that they think, okay, that should be the process to decide the controversy, the process to decide any disagreement. So that is all sides that they claim they cherish about the rule of law. But you can see that's the those people that are in establishments, they could be some of those that they are in the political elite and they care about the meritocracy. But those people that's the stand with the mass public, that's they care more about democracy. So as you may see that we, within the anti-establishment camp, we have yellow camp and black camp, but usually that's not necessarily separate, but sometimes they work together. As you can see, the yellow camp, especially the iconic ones would be in 2014, the umbrella movement. That's when you can see that's the style would be leader-centric, path-dependent. It means that they were called from like Gandhi's or civil disobedience, and that's they block the roads or etc. And also the intellectual elitism, that's the lots of the scholars or students could be the court leaders within the movement. And left-wing liberal agendas, that's they also really care about like democracy, freedom, without to care about their nationality, and also peaceful and organized. But we can see in 2019 protests, we call it water revolutions, whatever, that's they are wearing a black cloth, and what's the style of the protest could be leaderless and decentralized, no leaders that time. And that is from grassroots and anonymized populism and right-wing identity agendas, that they care about their own identity as Hong Kongers. And also that they could be very aggressive sometimes, but in terms of the tactics, and also very subtle because that's they're not really organized and stick at one place. That's they've been very agile. So because of the protest after 2019, and Beijing cannot tolerate any dissent, and they feel that is threatening to their political security. So they impose a national security law. And so what China's claim is that they said all the countries, even the democratic countries or Western countries, they have their national security law. So there is nothing wrong for China to fill in the loophole for Hong Kong to impose a national security law. But what the main distinction between China and Hong Kong in terms of the two system, one country, is that Hong Kong, although limit, but they have certain separation of power. So if that's the law have been manipulated or abused, the people still can do judiciary review and to make sure that civil liberty could be safeguarded. But if we can see back in China, the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, the first clause of it is CCP control almost everything. So we can see the CCP merge into the legislative, executive, and judiciary, all the organs, the state organs, to be under controlled by the party. So it could not be comparable with the Western or democratic countries, how that they've been on the same page to talk about national security. So on June 30, it will be the 1 year since the implementation of the Hong Kong National Security Law, as the Hong Kong National Security criminalized dissenting thoughts and speeches, such as ill-defined laws, crumbles the public confidence to the basic law, which guarantees certain freedom. After cleansing all dissents of all walks of life, pushing pro-democracy activists in jail or in exiles, disqualifying opposition politicians from public offices, arresting and harassing the journalists, shutting down the media which are not with the government, brainwashing the younger generations, pushing the national security education, promoting officials who are notorious with their suppressive tactics, and all the promise of freedom based on specific system in Hong Kong had gone. And now Hong Kong, from my personal perspective, is undeniably becoming to be a police state and totalitarian region. So what the pro-Beijing camps that they were focusing on the output legitimacy, what is the so-called good result, but the good result, what is good, can be divided by power. And the people that they wanted to fight it back to achieve more input legitimacy. What is the representation? That is election, whether that is appointment. So that they wanted to have input legitimacy. So how to build trust for the future of pro-democracy movement? We can also see that usually the tactics, we can see the prominent individuals that speak for local Hong Kongers with foreign politicians, that they would lobby with political elites. But some of the challenges for this claim would be obfuscated into exclusive vast interest circles if they cannot get in touch with the mass public of people back in Hong Kong or around the world. But if we talk about to address this kind of the challenge, we tried to set up the groups to engage with mass public or civil society to develop diaspora communities for claiming stakes of the society. Is it work? And one of the challenges for us is how to be not deorganized into competing factions with each other. So this is just my personal proposal. That's the stage one, the rescuing, and we set up the Haven Assistant to introduce or share the public information of the asylum for people to get help. And the second, like Hong Kongers in Britain or any other Hong Kongers group in the UK or around the world, to solidify the Hong Kong people together. And finally, maybe it's like a very broad platform to empower the people who have a vote, to let them to have their representative to discuss the future as the Hong Kong people. And third question I wanted to ask the audiences in here, whether that you believe that is rising China or waning West. What do you think about China model? And what do you think about the soft power of discourse? For example, what we heard about the state media, overseas branches, the propaganda external to external parties. What do you believe that is bipolar new Cold War will be ahead, or multipolar globalization you believe in the future? Whether that you will feel more important how governed or why they can govern. And we can see from Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, first, from communism to state capitalism, you can see Deng Xiaoping did it. And from anti-imperialism to neo-imperialism, that you can see Mao did anti-imperialism and Xi now that they're becoming a new imperialism using Belt and Road Initiative to exert their economic influence around the world. And Hong Kong international business or financial status, Deng Xiaoping drive the West into Chinese economy because they opened their economy to the world. They did reform. But Xi Jinping, they tried to project the Chinese influence over the world. And we can see back in Hong Kong, so-called one country systems in reinforcing the petro-client relations and reinforcing why the CCP can, which is the output legitimacy. So in terms of the power and ideology, do you feel that the structures, international relations is important, or you feel the thought of the leadership matters? Which one is more important? And in the future, do you feel we can avoid the war? So hopefully, from the example of Hong Kong, we can get more hints and you can think more about these details and questions in the future. Thank you. I leave it to Julian.
Well, thank you very much for that tour de force, Simon. You have certainly been asking very provocative questions and given us a very interesting analysis. Is Hong Kong now a police state, you say? And how will the Communist Party of China claim legitimacy? Likewise, do the protesters represent Hong Kongers today? We will have to answer those questions later as we now turn to our next speaker. Julian will be speaking from the point of view of Hong Kongers in Britain because he has set this up with Simon and is really a very effective, it's hopefully a charitable organization time to come. At the moment, it's a non-profit. So may I just pass over to Julian to share with us his work and about the surveys, webinars, and maybe practical tips to Hong Kongers who are thinking of coming over to UK and how they might learn to integrate into British society. Over to you, Julian.
Great. Thank you so much, Marlene, for the introduction, and thanks, Simon, for the presentation just now. So indeed, Simon and I have set up the Hong Kongers in Britain last year as a civil society organization, and you can see ourselves as an expat, diaspora, and community building group. Our objectives is to primarily provide assistance, advice, and support for the Hong Konger community who are coming to or just arrived in the UK. And we're hoping to enable and empower them to settle, integrate, and contribute towards British society. Well, our wider aims is to safeguard the rights of Hong Kongers who are seeking asylum or protection from improper treatments such as detention or potentially deportation, and to also inform and share with British society the culture and community of Hong Kongers, and also to Hong Kongers about British society and culture, and also to promote racial harmony and enhance social cultural connections between Hong Kongers and UK society. So we have 5 departments in HKB, which we've set up. The first is public affairs, which partakes in civil affairs through research and publications we've been doing. So we're trying to build relations with various public institutions, in addition to organizing community efforts in engaging with UK grassroots, communicate the spirit of Hong Kong within UK society. We also have social connections, where we organize events to bring solidarity to Hong Kongers in Britain, provide them opportunities to gain connections and nurture a community spirit. We have business development, providing a platform and business consultancy on business plans and also on setting up businesses for Hong Kongers in Britain. And also cultural development, where we are promoting projects produced by Hong Kong artists. And we're hoping to establish and promote the culture of Hong Kong and reinforce that community spirit of Hong Kongers through the medium of culture. And finally, last but not least, life in the UK, where we're providing assistance for Hong Kongers so that they can settle and integrate effectively into British society, including immigration advice, career education, legal advice, where we refer to professional advice where necessary. It's important why we went about setting up Hong Kongers in Britain in the first place, and we came up with a general stance which will guide our work, and these are the main principles of why we are doing what we're doing. So first is that we emphasize the BNO status as British nationals and Commonwealth citizens as a specific and legally recognized identity, rather than only a travel document, to maintain the UK's historical commitment towards the freedom towards Hong Kong people, which Alistair very effectively put earlier. But the BNO visa is a direct result of China breaching the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the significant sacrifices made by pro-democratic Hong Kongers. It's not an economic migration scheme, but a lifeboat scheme. And we want to inclusively safeguard the rights of BNO citizens, and they're also the dependents, as well as non-BNO Hong Kongers in the UK. And we would emphasize that respecting democracy and freedom are not political stances, but actually universal values and common sense that are shared across the UK society and also across the liberal democratic world. So we want to transform this perspective that Hong Kong is not only a place, but a diasporic people sharing and practicing common culture and values. And we are determined to maintain ourselves as a cross-partisan expat group, providing practical support to Hong Kongers in the UK. And finally, to facilitate settling and integration of Hong Kongers, the equality of opportunities and enhancing social cultural connections between Hong Kongers and British society. So just to give you more of a flavor of the activities that we've been doing over the past year since we've set up. Well, first is the Poppy Run, where we organize small-scale marathon, allowing Hong Kongers to understand more about UK history and culture, while showing Hong Kongers solidarity and connection with the UK, reminding Hong Kongers that we stand with the UK and the liberal world for the hard-earned peace and liberal order due to our common democratic beliefs and spirits against expanding totalitarianism. In our earlier days, we also did a webinar on experience sharing of Hong Kongers in the UK and what life has been like for them. We did another webinar on welcoming Hong Kongers and setting up new life in the UK as a pre-departure briefing guide in January, providing tips and advice and a checklist that we hope that they can use. We also did a webinar on professional advice in the UK, including immigration and visa, property conveyance, personal finances, taxation, education. A little bit more recently, we did a campaign for the Census 2021, We Are Hong Kongers, where we worked with another group called Power to Hong Kongers to encourage Hong Kongers to put their identity as Hong Kongers into the census, more accurately reflecting the Hong Kong community presence in the UK. We also wrote several open letters to the Home Office to clarify leave outside of the rule policies on working rights and address the issue of affordability of the BNO visa related fees, which saw the UK government allowing those at imminent risk of destitution to be able to access help. And we also managed to set a precedent for LOTR rejection reversal through referral to lawyers. We also did a UK local election empowerment campaign where in April we held an informal webinar encouraging Hong Kongers to register to vote. We're not telling them which party to vote for, but to understand the importance of engaging in democracy and in their communities by following trending topics, issues, discussions, and to exercise their civic duties and responsibilities as UK citizens, that they have the rights to vote and also to be voted. More recently, we are doing some online, free online English classes. We have 8 teachers, around 200 students have signed up as we identified the need for English language ESOL support, particularly in more informal and everyday use in order to build their confidence in the use of English. Only last week, we did a London walking tour, allowing new arrivals to understand more about the city and the communities. And most recently, we have started a campaign which is called Free the Books. That's our latest and ongoing effort to collect and encourage the donation of books which are already banned or will soon be banned in Hong Kong due to the NSL and the censorship of the press, curtailing the freedom of speech, press, publication, including, as we mentioned earlier on, the closing of the Apple Daily newspaper over the past week. So British Library and Bodleian Library at Oxford University have agreed to accept book donations through HKB. We are also providing services. A few months ago, we provided a guide, a manual on UK asylum policy, along with Haven Assistance and Hong Kong Assistance and Resettlement Community, as well as a volunteer immigration lawyer. So we hope that this is a life-saving guide for those who are looking towards this option. Also, we are providing professional services referrals and also mental and career coaching. More lately, we have been working on a series of publications starting from last year, at the end of last year, where we publish a comprehensive research on BNO holders intending to come to the UK. We named it Coming for Hope, regarding who is considering immigration to the UK and when, whether and when will they apply for the BNO visa scheme, their concerns and preparedness in transiting to a new life in the UK, UK, their vulnerabilities or concerns in connection to the Hong Kong protests, and also the demographics, including age groups, qualifications, income, and so on. So we were trying to find out about the needs and concerns of Hong Kongers moving to the UK, identifying potential issues with UK policies and laws, and offering potential solutions, policy recommendations, and suggestions. We also worked with Hackney Chinese Community Services and Hong Kong ARC at the beginning of this year to come up with a joint piece of recommendation to support Hong Kongers' arrivals, as we were invited by a Greater London Authority to draw up these recommendations. So we covered areas including safety, security, immigration, university, schools, housing, employment, mental health support, information hub, translation, and interpretation. A little while ago, we did a briefing on housing situation for BNOs arriving in the UK, because from our December research, we found out that accommodation is the single biggest concern for amongst Hong Kongers. We were invited by MHLG to find out a little bit more about the issue, and we conducted a large-scale online public consultation where we hope to reflect direct information and insights collected from the Hong Kong public about their hopes and needs and so on. And we're hoping to support, enhance, and guide the work program of the Welcoming Committee for Hong Kongers and the UK government. And yesterday and the day before, we published a survey report on where Hong Kongers intend to go in the UK. So we did a survey to provide up-to-date information on where they would like to go, whether they intend to move after 6 months of arrival, if so where, if they have children, if they have in need of school places, and so on. And all this is to, again, support the government in terms of the implementation of the £43 million welcoming package, and to allocate resources a bit more precisely according to the local councils, and also allow VSCEs, the VCSEs, the voluntary community social enterprises, to prepare for projects serving Hong Kongers' needs in different areas and regions. And finally, to allow the general public, including new arrivals, to understand and welcome the BNO community. So we do have quite an extensive network of organizations, institutions who we are partnering with, working with in terms of providing the different services, advice. So we are, we welcome anyone contacting us and to reach out to these different communities and groups as well, to hopefully better implement and support the BNO welcoming package. So this is the way in which you can find us and contact us. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Julian. You have certainly galloped through the long list of activities and your very extensive program. I'm sure everyone here, both on the panel and in the audience, are very impressed by the work of HKB. For those who are not aware, Hong Kongers who are coming in under this new scheme have no access to public funds, primarily, and the 43 million package is filtered through local authorities and for very specific targeted projects. So I'm delighted to hear that that HKB is working with multilateral institutions to ensure that the needs are met. So now turning to our final speaker to round up the session, this part of the session, we have Baroness Selbrinton. And I did ask her for permission to share with you a little tidbit that she actually grew up in Hong Kong when she was little, till she was age 5, probably knows a few Cantonese words from then. But the point is that she does have a special place in her heart for Hong Kong. She's also the Lord's spokesperson on health, has held various portfolios, including in education in Europe, and is on the LD, which is the Association of Liberals and Democrats in Europe's bureau, and has also extensive experience as a county councillor, so she will know how local authorities work and how maybe Hong Kongers can benefit from that. So over to you, Sal. Thank you.
Marlene, thank you. And thank you to all the speakers so far. I mean, my goodness, what an enormous breadth of discussion we've had. And if you'll forgive me for just continuing briefly with the personal history, because although I was very small, my parents loved their time in Hong Kong. And we were close friends with a journalist, Anthony Gray, who some years after we left was imprisoned by Mao Zedong in retaliation for 5 Chinese journalists being imprisoned for potential spying activities. And I am proud to say that aged 8 or 9, my first political activity was writing postcards to him in prison. I don't know what the Chinese prison guards thought of a child's postcards, but of course, I wrote about, you know, my brother had his birthday last week. Mummy made him a birthday cake, all of those things, because as far as I was concerned, that was it. But talking to journalists over the years, that sort of public action just reminds the authorities that there are people watching, even if they are youngish children. We were also in Hong Kong at a time when there were a large number of people in China trying to get to Hong Kong. And I do remember hearing, again, mainly memories after we left, of people who had tried to escape from the Great Leap Forward and the dreadful famine and the way any dissenters were treated. So I think what we're seeing now, my family were always fearful that there would come a time when China would try to exert its totalitarian approach to Hong Kong, despite the attempts of the international community to stop that from happening. And I think that I echo all the points that have been made so far to say, you know, we absolutely are standing at a crossroads. More importantly, perhaps China is standing at a crossroads, because they have discovered that through their actions in Hong Kong, with the Uyghurs, their approach to Taiwan, the international community has come together, something I think they thought would never happen. And providing we can remain together, regardless of our own political affiliation, as Alistair so ably expressed earlier on, I think we may be able to have some minor influences. I'm not going to suggest it's anything more than that at the moment, but the fact that the Chinese authorities announced about a month ago that they were trying to work out how to love bomb the West made me think they've suddenly understood that being a pariah state, even if you're powerful, is not helpful. And I think the pandemic has also helped to make that important. So the other historical point I wanted to make, there's been a mention of the extraordinary work that Paddy Ashdown did in the early 80s. After my father came back, he continued as a broadcaster. He then became an MP, and he was an MP from 79 to 87. And I know that he spoke in Parliament in support of Hong Kong, in support of Hong Kongers and their rights to British passports. And it's certainly over the years, it's been something that's brought people of all parties together. And I think, again, Alistair has referred to that. I see it to this day in the House of Lords, where we have people from our benches, we have crossbenchers like David Alton, we have people like Chris Patton, who still stands up and speaks as well. And we will provide those pinpricks. Whenever we ask a question in Parliament, the Foreign Office is required to write to the Chinese ambassador. And I just call it the pinpricks of rebellion, lots of little pinpricks. And we will continue to do that, because then there has to be a response. And our ambassador in China also has sometimes to be sent to the Chinese authorities to demand things. And, you know, I'm grateful for the briefings that we've had from a number of Hong Kongers over the last few years, and particularly now Hong Kong in Britain movement, to make sure that we have the right information so that we can make sure that we can get that. Simon, I found your organogram of the political spectrum enormously helpful in understanding things, because obviously, you know, as a Westerner, one tends to think in one's own very Western way, but this was very helpful. And the distinction between the yellow and the black rebellion against what's going on was extraordinarily interesting. I suspect, you know, having talked about internationally, regardless of political stance, people being able to come together, I suspect there is still a fairly big gap between the yellows and the blacks in Hong Kong, and absolutely recognize that. But I certainly understand much more as a result of what you've been saying. And I think I do agree with you. I'm very concerned that Hong Kong is moving into the totalitarian state that China is used to managing. And we have to ensure that politicians across the world continue to call things out. It may be harder and harder for individuals in Hong Kong to do that. But certainly, as speaking as someone who joined the Liberals because I'm an internationalist, I know that the Liberals and Liberals across the world will continue to do that, but it won't just be us, others will do it as well. I'm interested to see the proposal for a possible Hong Kong shadow parliament. My first husband, who's also a Liberal, was a member of the Latvian shadow parliament prior to the Berlin Wall coming down and the Baltic states regaining. And actually, it was very, very empowering for both those expatriates and those in exile, but also for helping, as things did change, to put them on an extremely strong footing in developing their own democracy. So I think that's an excellent proposal. Julian, your extraordinary contribution just shows how motivated and concerned HKB is about ensuring that Hong Kongers who arrive in Britain, want to come to Britain, have the best access to the best advice and support. And I completely agree with everything that you said. And I just want to do one other historic note. I am so delighted with your urging people to contribute to the 2021 census and be quite specific. My cousin, who was one of the first women in the House of Lords, was a suffragist. She wasn't a suffragette, she was a suffragist. During the 1911 census, the suffragettes boycotted the census. The suffragists all wrote in on the census form, votes for women. Who remembers now who said what? The answer is sometimes you have to use the system to keep that voice heard, not just for the immediate future, but actually for the archive in the future as well. So thank you for doing that. And I'm also delighted to hear about your encouraging people to engage in local democracy. As Liberal Democrats, we work hard with our communities in local government. And I know where I live in Watford, we actually have leaflets going out in Polish for our Polish community, and we make contact with a large number of them. So I hope that Lib Dems across the country, given this is broadly a Liberal webinar, will also pick that up. But I think actually other parties will too. I echo your concerns about accommodation probably being one of the greatest worries. The accommodation crisis in the UK at the moment is enormous. And without access to public funds, I would say the one thing that we have learned over the years, particularly working with those who are refugees fleeing from problems in their own countries who have arrived here, and you're not in that category, I completely understand that, but our local communities actually, for all the small number of stories about difficulties in being treated, the vast majority of our local communities have supported asylum seekers and do so in the most extraordinary ways. I think you're right to start talking to church communities and others, but there are plenty of other communities locally who will want to support you. And I think that that we shall do that. And I will be asking my elected mayor what we're doing with Hong Kongers in Britain, in Watford. That's my take home away from this. And I see I'm also about to run out of time, but I've found this extraordinarily useful from the micro detail that Julian has talked about of people wanting to come to Britain and how they manage in Britain, and what we, by the way, as parliamentarians have to do to help smooth that way, to Simon's big picture of what's happening in Hong Kong and how that impacts on the international political scene. And Alistair for setting that in such an extraordinary liberal context and what's happened really over the last 30, 40 years. I have found this extremely helpful. And although we aren't going to resolve any of the issues, what I do think is it's going to empower us to continue to campaign stronger and make sure that the voice of Hong Kongers is heard, whether in Hong Kong or in Britain.
Thank you, Sal. That was really amazing that you managed to round up everything so quickly on the spot, as well as add those lovely personal anecdotes and accounts which tie you to Hong Kong and such wonderful memories of the people whose lives you've touched. So thank you to all the panelists. I'm just going through some questions which are on my screen. And before I read out the first question that I'll ask, I will just like to make a couple of observations. Simon's chart shows that there are those who are for establishment and those who are for security, stability, versus those who are more anarchic, may I say. Hong Kong has always been known to be a financial hub, and the economy has always been very important to the residents, as well as to China, I might add. So as an interesting fact for the audience, Hong Kong contributed 20% towards China's economy in the 1990s. This dropped to less than 3% in 2019. So some will say maybe China does not need Hong Kong so much today, although obviously Hong Kong is very much part of the Greater Bay Area in their 5-year plan. But maybe Hong Kongers have less leverage financially now. I'm just throwing that in. Another point of observation is that a lot of Hong Kongers emigrated overseas in the last 20 years, but then a lot have also subsequently returned to work in Hong Kong. Now, do we see a new brain drain? Is the opposite happening, or are Hong Kongers seeing that they're being competed out of the local job market? So these are just things I'm throwing out. You don't have to answer them yet. Turning to the first chat that is on my screen, which is from Linda Chung. She says, please express my thanks to everyone for the very full and illuminating presentations. My questions. Simon's political landscape presentation is indeed a tour de force, but he appears to show strong separation between establishment and non-establishment. Can there not be a joint ground and peace between the two? For example, sticking to the rule of law, i.e. no violence, is an establishment rule, but he implies violence may be justifiable. Question for Julian and Simon. You continually refer, this is still from Linda, you continually refer yourselves as Hong Kongers, but do not say you are ethnically Chinese. Have you disowned that terminology now? So that is really a very important question of identity. And I believe that maybe what people from Hong Kong are going through is this something of an identity crisis. And just to share that, as well as being on Lib Dem overseas, I co-founded Chinese Liberal Democrats with Linda, in fact, 15 years ago. And recently we thought of changing our name from Chinese Liberal Democrats to East Asian Liberal Democrats, but that resolution did not pass. So Chinese could mean China nationality, or it could just mean our race. So that's a question of our identities. So may I start first, maybe with Alistair, that we haven't heard from for a while, what he thinks of the political landscape and whether violence can ever be justified.
Goodness, that's a sort of profound philosophical question. I don't know that I would ever want to say that violence can be justified unless you get into the whole concept of a just war and the rest of it, which is something that philosophers have been struggling with for millennia now. What I do know is that it is occasionally the case that violence will be inevitable where you have no other means for a community to express their wishes. So, you know, when you have a legislative council that is being shorn of any authority and democratic legitimacy, when you have a law that says that those who want to put themselves forward for it must first of all be vetted for their political purity, so to speak, then you do eventually create that environment where violence is sadly inevitable, and I fear that's what you've seen in Hong Kong in recent years. So I don't want to condone violence, but you know, if you look at the different struggles around the world, certainly in my lifetime, then there is no denying the fact that violence has been part of the resolution of them. And you know, my focus would always be on the encouragement and promotion of non-violent direct action. So Sal and her postcards, for example, a very good example of that. You know, I've worked with Amnesty International on different campaigns over the decades. And Amnesty, as you will know, have campaign technique as a cellular organization, and they organize writing campaigns to prisoners of conscience around the world. And it's very often, you know, you think you're sending these postcards and these letters off into a void that nobody's ever going to see, but you know, it's only in those moments where you realize, or when you do get somebody released and you do have contact with them, and I've been on death row meeting people subject to the death penalty before, and they tell you just how much they do get from that sort of direct action. And you know, if I think of the big political campaigns, global political campaigns in my lifetime, one would be the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and the other was on the ending of the Cold War and the Berlin Wall coming down. And on both these occasions, we had taken direct non-violent action, and it was, you thought that you were just screaming into the void. You thought you were beating your head against a brick wall. And then when you least expect it, that is when change happens. You know, if you think back to that day when Nelson Mandela walked out of prison in South Africa, you know, that just seemed to be unraveling at a pace that was unimaginable. When the Berlin Wall came down, it was just the same. You know, I think that's why it is important that those of us who have the privilege of free speech should make the case for democracy in Hong Kong. I'm sure it is heard. It may not be welcome, but it is heard. And just when you least expect it, change will come. You know, look, I'll tell you quite candidly, one of the more disappointing contributions to the debate recently came from Vince Cable and his analysis of the situation in Xinjiang province and the Uyghur population there. You know, I think that we can have an open discussion, and I'm open to having this discussion because I don't want to see China isolated, about how we engage with the CCP and the Chinese government. But you know, to try and diminish or somehow deny what is going on in a area like that actually doesn't help anyone at all. And as I say, I found that a very disappointing contribution to the debate.
Thank you, Alistair. May I turn now to our young speakers for a response to the points that were raised by Linda. First, Simon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate that the remark from Baroness, and of course that's MP. I'm absolutely agree with all of you, your viewpoints. In response to the questions raised by Linda Chong, I want to say absolutely. I mentioned that it's a throughput legitimacy, which is all of the both sides that's the claim that's the really want it back to the rule of law. I think that is the hope, whether that's the people that have their own public confidence to basic law, because whether that's they will still feel as the law have been enshrined, the basic and sacred rights of the people could be respected by this minute constitution. But I think that's more responsibility will be on the establishment side, because that's they almost occupy most of the interest, economic interest, political power. So in terms, if that's the cannot fulfill, that's, you know, that's the people cannot be really satisfied with the situation now we see Hong Kong. The frustrations really cause violence, because that's as the author said, that's frustration caused the people, they have no other means to express their will. That's the only way that's been unfortunately becoming violence, that the vicious circles of the violence. And it really depends on, from different perspectives, some of the people that feel that is a legitimate revolution, as you might see, that's in other countries' history. But some of the people, if that has been finally failed, and the people would say that is rioters, that is riots, and that is a turmoil. So it really depends on the future, and that's the future when that's becoming history, and when that's the next generation to decide. But I do believe if we can stand with the justice, especially the social justice. For me personally, I always stand with the people without powers. I always stand with the people that believing in the rights that they think that is safeguarded. Unfortunately, to those people in Hong Kong, they have not many choice they can make, because the reality, the very harsh reality in front of their face is that either you take it or leave it, because they have guns. They have police officers over there, they have guns. What can you do? You wanted to have the government to listen to you, you don't have guns. That is the reality, to let the people to understand and that feeling. So I always said, yes, if we are based on realism, materialism, maybe that's the result, the outcome. Getting riches, rejuvenations of the Chinese civilization would make us happier. But if we can look back into the black side of the countries, because we love this country, we care about the Chinese people. As the Baroness mentioned, those journalists have been in prison. Those activists have been in prison. Their lives, their human lives. Where are they now? They are still like they're breathing, whether they're breathing or not. So that is what we cannot turn a blind eyes from it. And that's why we always mention it in front of those people holding power, to say, well, yeah, you have a lots of achievement, but how comes the shortcoming? Because you're holding power, we need to hold you to account. So that is democracy, we believe. So I leave it to Julian.
Thank you. Over to you, Julian.
I'd just like to answer the question about identity, because that's a very interesting question raised by Linda. Well, I think inherently, the vast majority of Hong Kongers would not deny that they are ethnically Chinese, or even some would say that culturally and historically they're even proud of being Chinese. They're just not socially or nationally, associated with mainland Chinese, and that's why the differentiation has been made more distinct, especially over the past few years. But I just want to say that it is not a binary choice, nor are the two terms mutually exclusive. It very much depends on who you ask. Some people would say that they feel more Hong Kong Chinese, some people would say even Chinese Hong Kongers, or some people would only say Hong Kong Hong Kongers. And you're right that it could be a little bit of an identity crisis. As the years evolve, once they move over here, they may see themselves increasingly more as British Hong Kongers or even British Chinese. We're not telling them how to feel, because these are very dependent on their own experiences and their perspectives, So I think it is interesting to see how these identities will continue to evolve, and I think it's important actually to research on how people Hong Kongers, see themselves in the years coming by. So we would like to make some surveys, as Hong Kong has always done, finding out how people identify themselves. So yeah, that's the long answer to your short question.
Yes, thank you. Sal, do you want to say a few words in response, particularly to my earlier question about how China doesn't need Hong Kong as much as it used to, whilst recognizing that from the Hong Kong people's point of view, they were never citizens of Hong Kong. There's no such thing as citizenship. It's more just residency and being with sovereignty with China. So they have always been Chinese in that sense. So Sal, my question is, what do you think? Has China won, and has it come at a cost to the international reputation?
Well, I think China thinks it's won. I'm not sure that it has yet. This is a long game. They think that just by applying their totalitarian approach, that's it. All they have to do is to control. But I think one of the things that this webinar and all the actions that are going on across the world by Hong Kongers who are now living abroad, and also by politicians around the world, shows that it is anything but over. How long it will take to play out, I have absolutely no idea. One of the reasons I mentioned Latvia and the Baltic states was that was a very long game. It took a long, long time, but I think Alistair is right to recognize, the impact, for example, of the anti-apartheid movement, how long all of that took. The point is that the international community will stand full square behind Hong Kongers for as long as it takes, and whatever the solution is. But I think the point I was making earlier is that China has suddenly understood that they can't just do it and expect no consequences from elsewhere in the world. That's a hopeful sign.
Merlin, can I maybe just add to that? Look, I don't think that China's wish to control Hong Kong is necessarily one that's just rooted in finance. I think it's a much more political concern than that. And if we hadn't sent the wrong signals right back between 84 and 97 and subsequently, then the difficulties that the joint declaration ran into, and it's effectively dead now, would not actually have happened. So like I've just a week or two ago celebrated, if that's the word, 20 years as a member of parliament, and the one thing I have learned in 20 years as a parliamentarian is that you can't afford to compromise on the basics, on fundamentals and human rights, and that if whatever reason you may find for doing it only ends up making things worse at the end of the day.
Well, there are certainly lots of different narratives. And the next question I have is quite different, if I may read it out, from David Chalmers. Next year, Hong Kong is supposed to be hosting the Gay Games. Do the speakers believe that these games will be allowed to go ahead? Have you heard of the Gay Games? And I heard this morning that foreign visitors are likely to be excluded from the Beijing Winter Olympics, which could set a precedent for the Gay Games. Any guesses, anyone?
Well, I mean, look, there's two different issues at play there. One is in relation to the Winter Olympics being held in China, and I think that there are opportunities with that to highlight the Chinese human rights abuses, Chinese government human rights abuses, that is, and I think that it's up to individual countries and their athletes who attends and the rest of it, but that when you know what is going on, in particular in Xinjiang, and the use of slave labor in many Chinese brands that are available in the high streets here, and many big brands that are manufactured in China, where we now have significant evidence to suggest that slave labor is employed in the production supply chains there, then we should be putting pressure on all our governments and on those companies who would be wanting to get their their advertising out there that, in fact, they are party to something which is not actually to their credit. And I would want to see, and Leila Moran has done a lot of good work in this, the exposure of of slave labour within the supply chains for many brands who will be sponsors of the Winter Olympics. The Gay Games is an interesting one, David. I've not actually, first of all, I didn't know that the Gay Games was going to be in Hong Kong. It's an interesting angle. Whether it will be allowed to go ahead is not something over which we have any say. If it is allowed to go ahead and can go ahead in the same way that I always understand the Gay Games to have gone ahead, then I think it would be quite a strong signal to send about diversity and for you know, the operation of something like the Gay Games in Hong Kong. But it would have to be able to go ahead in the same terms in which it's gone ahead in every other venue that it's been held. And right at the moment, I think that's looking a bit unlikely, but I'll watch that one with some interest.
Sal, do you have any comments there?
I do. I mean, I think, first of all, if there is no foreigners allowed in for the Winter Olympics, I think the Olympic movement will have something to say to that, unless it's done under the cover of the pandemic. But, you know, we're months away from that decision being made. I always am mindful of the 1936 Berlin Olympics and how Jewish athletes, Black athletes, were able to take part and protected by their nationality from what was going on. And afterwards, they said it was a very difficult experience, but actually being able to be there and be visible was important. It's always a dilemma, isn't it? You know, does one pull out as a matter of principle, or do you go as a matter of principle? And in terms of the Gay Games, I think that's going to be very much a decision for the organisers. But we need to hear the arguments on both sides as it gets nearer. We have to start by objecting to anything that may be happening to LGBT community inside China. David, you're much more knowledgeable than I am on what's going on there. But I do think that watching what happens about the Winter Olympics is going to be the first step of that, because I do not think the Olympic movement would take kindly to no foreigners being allowed in.
Well, certainly we don't think that athletes should be penalized for whatever's happening in China or Hong Kong. So Simon and Julian, do you have any comments to this question, or shall I move on to the next?
I will leave the chance to Julian. Would you like to comment?
Well, we don't know what the pandemic situation will be like, but what we do know is that the Hong Kong government has been trying to use several excuses to ban different public gatherings or events taking place. Even tomorrow, there's traditionally supposed to be the largest march of the year, 1st of July, but that has been essentially blocked. And the Gay Games may also reflect, the Hong Kong government being quite hostile to any form of social rights being advocated, human rights included, and they are essentially seeing that as a threat. So they will do all, they will introduce all the means they can, I think, to stop that happening. So it wouldn't be a surprise at all, I think, to even most Hong Kongers if the Games will be called off for whatever reason that they can make up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on one side background, is that based on our experience in Hong Kong, we understood that Hong Kong is extraordinarily conservative to gay rights, to same-sex marriage. I think parts of the reason is that's usually the political elites that they have a background, that's the Catholic Church. I'm not sure why, but still, like what I heard is very, very hard to push the rights of the gay people. They try, and one of the former legislators publicly announced he is gay, but of course, he has been disqualified for political reason afterwards.
And more recently, there has been a couple, quite a high profile gay couple who has been trying to access housing in Hong Kong, but because they were determined that they were not heterosexual couples, that they were not allowed to access that. And unfortunately, one of them committed suicide. It's probably also with a myriad of other reasons. And finally, the court ruled that the authorities acted unlawfully, but it has unfortunately come rather too late. Yeah, so you can tell the level of or the lack of level of support from the government on these fronts. Yeah.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I hadn't thought about religion coming into the issue, because it's certainly true in many countries where the LGBT rights comes roughshod against some religious beliefs, but the law is there to protect everyone. So that should be respected, regardless of one's personal beliefs. Talking about, Julian, about the law and the courts, I have read that some of the British judges are considering stepping down from the Hong Kong bar. Should they do that? Because by saying they do not want to condone or support a judiciary that might be changing, and where the court system certainly is going to be secondary to Beijing's court system. But should the British judges consider stepping down? I don't know if Sal, you would like to answer my question there.
I think I'll defer to my learned friend over there.
All right.
Okay, I'll pick that one up. In case you don't know, I am a recovering lawyer. It's 20 years since I last put a black gown in my back, and probably legal practice is the better for that. But I think they absolutely should, because, you know, first of all, you understand that, again, it's not how we always see ourselves, but around the world, we are seen as being a force for good in terms of the rule of law. And that's why the current machinations of our own government is so damaging. But you know, I think for me, the point at which the balance tipped was the introduction of the National Security Law. So, you know, if you understand that the purpose of law and legal systems is to protect the people's individual rights, I know it maybe doesn't always look that way, but that's what they're there for. And if the system is constructed on something that is actually designed to deny people their individual rights, then I think British judges taking part in it, it gives legitimacy to a system that is otherwise not legitimate. And I say that with quite a sorry heart, because there was a long history of British legal jurisdictions interacting with the Hong Kong justice system. And in particular, one of the things that really shocked and disappointed me was when I saw how diminished the standing of the Hong Kong police force had become. As chair of the APPG in Hong Kong, we published a report. We took evidence from various very brave Hong Kongers who were even then risking their liberty by taking part in our investigation. And you know, what you had there was a police force which traditionally had very much operated along the same lines of policing by consent that we would recognise and appreciate here. And in fact, that, you know, that has now become an instrument for one side of the community to enforce their will on the other in a way that is no longer recognisable. And that, I think, was happening long before the National Security Law, but I'm afraid it has just galloped on ever since.
Thank you, Alistair. Seeing the appearance of Robert Woodthorpe Brown on the screen suggests that I have to wind this Q&A up. I just want to read two questions, which we won't be answering. Perhaps they are rhetorical. Paul Reynolds says, should the new slogan being plastered all over Hong Kong in the last few days, obey the party, be replaced by obey the citizens? And Sarah Page in France says, can I ask where does Russia sit in China's sights for the future of its world power status? We certainly don't have time to answer that one. So may I pass this over for Robert to wind up for us.
Thank you, Merlene, for some excellent chairing. In addition to being chairman of the Paddy Ashdown Forum, I'm also a member, the British member on the Bureau of Liberal International. And in 2014, we actually were in Hong Kong having an one of our executive committee meetings, and joined, and I have my own little yellow umbrella still as a souvenir from it. We joined the demonstrators, and on our way trying to get into Legco. And so therefore I have personal experience of it and of what you have been talking about. Simon and Julian, it was inspiring listening to you, and very best endeavor in all your endeavors. And some of your people want to join Chinese Lib Dems. I'm sure that Merlene and her colleagues will be very happy with it. Alistair and Sal, you shone as usual, and it's a privilege for PAF or to Paddy Ashdown Forum to have been able to host this. And thank you all, and thanks to the audience for listening. And I'm sure a lot of people will be wanting to look at the YouTube recording on our website to remind of what was said today. Thank you very much, all of you.